Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the wilderness. Not for a retreat, not for a scenic hike, and definitely not for a juice cleanse. You've just joined Moses and the Israelites on their legendary exodus out of Egypt. Sounds epic, right? Freedom, deliverance, divine miracles. Except, you forgot to read the fine print, because 10 minutes into this spiritual journey, and you're already dehydrated, sunburnt, and spiritually disoriented. Before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're into biblical breakdowns with a hint of sarcasm and a lot of dust. And comment where you're tuning in from. I want to know if anyone out there has worse blisters than the ones you're about to spiritually inherit. Now, back to your sandal-scorched nightmare. You've just walked out of Egypt, barely had time to celebrate, and now you're standing in a desert with a bunch of people who don't know where they're going, but are very sure they're right about everything. There's no water, no food, no toilets, and the guy in charge, Moses, isn't giving TED Talks. He's brooding somewhere with a staff, trying not to yell at the crowd again. Your grand moment of liberation is now just sweat and sand. You expected instant joy, a promised land with fruit trees and hammocks. What you got instead is a blistering horizon, screaming toddlers, and the collective realization that nobody packed snacks. You're not even sure if Moses has a map, or if he's just winging it with divine directions and a serious sunstroke. And while we're here, let's talk about that miraculous Red Sea moment. Yes, it was dramatic. Walls of water, Pharaoh's army destroyed, 10 out of 10 climax. But the emotional high wore off fast. And now, you're walking, and walking, and walking. You don't even know what time it is because you lost your sundial and your sense of purpose back near Sinai. Your feet are bleeding, your lips are cracking, and the only thing louder than the wind is the sound of thousands of people arguing over whether this was actually a good idea. Every step forward feels like a mistake you don't want to admit. Your body's aching, your patience is gone, and you're starting to understand why the Israelites complained every 5 minutes. It's not a lack of faith, it's a lack of shade. Congratulations, you escaped slavery and entered a multi-decade spiritual boot camp with no exit strategy, no coffee, and absolutely no Wi-Fi. You're not a pilgrim, you're a prisoner of divine timing. And guess what? It only gets hotter from here. You wake up coughing, not because you're sick, though give it time, but because you've inhaled a mouthful of sand. Again, it's in your eyes, your ears, your hair, your undergarments, assuming you still wear those in this spiritual apocalypse. The desert is not just a setting, it's a lifestyle, a gritty, choking, exfoliating presence that makes sure you never feel clean, rested, or remotely enthusiastic about your holy pilgrimage. And before you consider packing up your tent and calling it quits, take a second to like the video, subscribe if your skin hasn't already cracked from dryness, and comment below what your worst camping experience was. I guarantee this will top it. Back to your suffering. Your sandals, blessed though they may be, are no match for the endless dunes. The straps are digging into your swollen feet. Your toes are blistered. You've started referring to your ankles as former joints. You've walked for hours, and the view hasn't changed. Just dunes, wind, and that one scorpion you're trying very hard not to make eye contact with. The air is thick with heat, but dry enough to burn the inside of your nostrils. Shade. Not unless you stand under Moses' beard, and even that's probably full of sand too. You try to brush yourself off, but the more you brush, the deeper it embeds. Sand in your pores, sand in your blanket, sand in your breakfast. You've stopped chewing because it's all just gritty manna anyway. Every time the wind kicks up, you instinctively flinch, pulling your tunic over your face like that'll stop anything. You've turned into a sentient dust rag, dragging your hopes behind you like the last broken wheel of a very spiritual IKEA cart. And let's not ignore what this is doing to your mental health. You're cranky, chapped, and about 2 complaints away from divine retribution. But honestly, how are you not supposed to complain? You've been journeying for what feels like eternity, with no destination in sight, and every single surface in this holy wasteland wants to be part of your skin. You thought this would be a sacred adventure, maybe a glowing pillar, a heartfelt prayer, a communal song. Instead, it's just you, clenching your teeth around a mouthful of desert and wondering if you can actually die from irritation alone. People keep saying the desert is a place of refinement, a place where God tests, teaches, transforms. But right now, it mostly feels like a punishment for having ankles. Your soul isn't being refined, it's being exfoliated into oblivion. And guess what? You still have 39.5 years of this exfoliation left. So breathe deeply, just not too deeply. You'll choke on sand. Again, rise and shine. If the sun hasn't already fried your eyelids shut, it's morning in the wilderness, which means it's time for your daily helping of heaven's blandest miracle, manna. That flaky white stuff that appears like frost on the ground just before sunrise. It's technically food, which is a strong word when your breakfast tastes like the inside of a pillow and has the consistency of regret. Before you grab your wooden spoon, don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you're still emotionally nourished, and drop a comment if you've ever cried while eating something technically edible. You shuffle out of your tent, still dust-covered and half dreaming of real food. Maybe a little garlic, some onions, a fried egg on toast. But no, your gourmet options are limited to picking up flakes from the dirt while trying not to sneeze them into oblivion. You reach down, grab a handful, and stare at it like it might surprise you. It won't. It never does. The flavour is described in ancient texts as like wafers made with honey, which is generous. Imagine stale communion bread that's been lightly misted with spiritual ambiguity. Everyone around you is pretending it's fine. At least we have food, they say, as if nutritional adequacy somehow replaces joy. Your neighbour swears she's found a way to toast it over coals and almost make it taste like something. Another guy tried boiling it into a paste, which made everyone angry and vaguely nauseated. Some people just eat it dry. They've given up. You're not far behind, and don't you dare try to save it for later. God was very clear. Manna is a one-day deal. Try hoarding it, and by morning it'll be a maggot buffet with a side of divine disappointment. You've learned the hard way. Twice. The worms were personal. It's like the food itself has a personality, needy, clingy, and morally upright. No seconds, no leftovers, no seasoning, just trust, obedience, and another helping of bland. You ask Moses if there's any chance of variety, maybe some dates, a pomegranate, literally anything else, and he just gives you that look. The "I didn't ask for this either" look. The same one he used during the water from a rock incident. He's tired, you're tired, and the manna is somehow both too much and never enough. You chew, slowly, thoughtfully, trying to find a metaphor in the mouthful. Is this a lesson about contentment, dependence, humility? Probably, but you'd still trade it for a cinnamon roll and a non-judgmental silence. By the time you're finished, your soul feels fuller than your stomach, which is either spiritual growth or mild starvation. And when tomorrow comes, same routine, same flakes, same hollow encouragement from the guy who insists he's actually starting to like it. You pray for gratitude, but mostly you just pray for a miracle that tastes like something other than obedience. You've eaten your manna. You've tried to feel grateful. You've forced down the holy flakes with a side of spiritual humility. But now the moment has arrived, the one you've been dreading since day one in the desert. Nature is calling, and unlike your polite plumbing back home, this call doesn't come with porcelain, privacy, or any kind of dignity. It comes with a trek to the edge of the camp, a shovel, and the cold realization that you are very much alone in this process. Well, you and God, and probably a few scorpions. No one talks about it directly, but it's the unsung trauma of the wilderness experience. You wake up, brush the sand off your tunic, and begin the slow walk of shame past tents and judgmental eyes, carrying your digging tool like a badge of biological defeat. If you're lucky, you find a semi-private spot beyond the camp perimeter. If you're unlucky, you make direct eye contact with someone else mid-squat, and both of you immediately begin reconsidering your life choices. There are no outhouses, no stalls, not even a sad little tent with a curtain. It's you, the dirt, and a breeze that refuses to mind its own business. You dig your hole like the law requires, trying to pretend this is normal, trying to channel your inner stoic, trying not to think about the fact that there are about 600,000 other people doing this exact same thing every day, and that statistically you are stepping on ancient invisible landmines from yesterday's regret, and heaven forbid you go at night. The desert is pitch black, and the only light comes from the stars and your own creeping sense of horror. Every twig snap sends your soul into flight. Every rustle could be a snake, a lizard, or worse, a fellow camper with the same urgent problem. You end up praying more in these moments than during actual prayer time, begging for a quick exit and no bites. Of course, there's a ritual to it. Cleanliness is next to godliness after all, but when your only options for hygiene are dust and a water ration that barely covers your own hydration, cleanliness becomes more of a theory than a practice. You start to understand why everyone smells like a campfire and mild defeat. No one tells you how important plumbing is to your spiritual life until it's gone. Suddenly, the discipline of the desert isn't just about obedience, it's about bodily coordination, emotional resilience, and praying your neighbors keep their eyes to themselves. You think about Egypt again, not for the leaks this time, but for the bathroom stalls. Sure, there was slavery, but at least there were walls. So you dig, you do your business, you cover it up like the Torah says, and you walk back to camp like nothing happened. But you know, and the desert knows. And the next time manna hits your digestive system, the cycle of holy humiliation begins again. The sun hasn't even cracked the horizon, and Moses is already pacing like a man with 600,000 problems and not enough divine patience. You haven't even opened your eyes fully, and from across the camp you hear the unmistakable sound of spiritual frustration. Footsteps in the dirt, staff thudding against rocks, and the low rumble of a man one complaint away from losing his prophetic mind. You stretch, yawn, sit up in your tent, and there he is. The man of God himself, muttering into the sky before you've had your ceremonial cup of disappointment manna. Let's be clear, Moses is tired, not just physically, existentially. He's been carrying this nation of professional whiners on his back since the burning bush. And at this point, he's running on fumes and miracles. His beard is longer, his patience shorter, and every day he wakes up to the sound of someone else asking for something new. More food, more water, more answers, less walking, less sun, less responsibility, and none of them ever ask how he's doing. And today, you can tell it's going to be a bad one. He's got that look in his eyes, the one that says he's already argued with God before breakfast. Again. And probably lost. His face is somewhere between divine exhaustion and full-scale meltdown. And to be fair, you'd be mad too. Imagine being told to lead a nation through the desert without air conditioning, a budget, or a map, all while getting feedback from people who just compared you to a leaky water jug because you forgot the cucumbers of Egypt. Moses doesn't get a day off. He doesn't get a nap. He doesn't get emotional support from the elders because they're too busy arguing about tabernacle measurements. His brother Aaron keeps making questionable leadership decisions. His sister's still recovering from divine leprosy, and half the camp keeps suggesting going back to Egypt like it was a wellness spa instead of a death trap. You try to greet him, smile, say something encouraging, but all you get in return is a nod so heavy it might collapse the tent poles. He's not mad at you, technically. He's just mad that God gave him a nation of adults who act like toddlers and called it a covenant. It's not personal, it's theological burnout. And when Moses finally storms off toward the tent of meeting, muttering something about needing a word, you lie back down and pull your scratchy blanket over your face. Because if Moses is already like this, what hope do the rest of you have? In the wilderness, there are no alarm clocks. Only prophets with bloodshot eyes and divine assignments they can't return. And when Moses wakes up angry, it's not just a bad day, it's a sign from heaven that things are about to get dramatic. You've heard of long journeys. You've done a couple. That one road trip with the broken AC. The red-eye flight with the screaming toddler. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared you for this. A divine detour so long it requires generational turnover. You look at the horizon and realize it's the same horizon as yesterday. And the day before, and probably 15 years from now. Because in the wilderness, time is a suggestion and progress is an illusion. And that promised land, it's just out of reach, eternally almost there, like a cosmic joke that never lands. People keep saying it was supposed to take 11 days, 11, not years, not decades, 11. But someone, no names, thought it was a good idea to build a golden calf. And then someone else thought it was cool to grumble about the menu. And then the entire nation collectively failed their trust fall with God. So now, here you are. In a never-ending loop of spiritual recalibration that looks suspiciously like walking in circles and hoping no one notices. You've started to forget what direction you're even heading in. East? West? Emotionally sideways? You stopped counting days and started measuring time by how many pairs of sandals you've emotionally destroyed. People have grown up in this desert. Babies born in tents now have their own tents. You've watched your neighbours grow grey under the weight of disappointment and sandstorms. Some of them don't even believe in the promised land anymore. They just believe in dust and dehydration. Moses doesn't help much. He tries. But every time he climbs a mountain, he comes back with more commandments and fewer smiles. You want to ask him for an updated itinerary, maybe a rough estimate of arrival time, but his glare makes you reconsider. You settle for praying, which honestly just sounds like sighing now. The elders are constantly trying to keep morale high. This is a season of refining, they say, while chewing the same bread flakes they've had for the past 2 decades. They call it character development. You call it punishment in real time. You want to believe there's a purpose to all this. That maybe when you finally see the land flowing with milk and honey, something inside you will unlock. But right now, your only flowing experience is sweat. Someone tries to cheer you up with a psalm, you throw them a look that says, "Don't." Even the Levites have run out of songs. Even the animals look spiritually exhausted. And when you realize you're still not even halfway through this pilgrimage, something deep in your soul breaks. Not in a dramatic, fiery way, just a quiet, subtle cracking, like the final straw in a very dry bundle of despair. 40 years. That's the sentence. That's the lesson. That's the journey. You thought you were going on a trip. Turns out you were being enrolled in Wilderness University. And the graduation rate? Not great. It's the middle of the night. The desert is finally quiet. The wind has calmed, and for a few glorious minutes, your itchy linen tunic isn't trying to strangle you in your sleep. You're just about to drift off. Finally, when suddenly the sky explodes. Again. The entire horizon lights up like divine pyrotechnics, and there it is, the pillar of fire. Bright, blazing, and completely uninterested in your circadian rhythm. You groan, roll over, pretend it's ambient light. It isn't. God's guidance is a full-on visual effects display, and unfortunately, it doesn't come with a dimmer switch. You thought maybe, just maybe, the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night was more metaphorical. It's literal. It hovers. It blazes. It moves when it wants. And it does not care about your REM cycle. You could be mid-dream, deep into your fantasy of the promised land having bathtubs and fresh fruit, and suddenly someone's yelling, "The fire's moving, pack your things." So now you're stumbling around half asleep, dragging a tent pole and swearing under your breath while your neighbour trips over his goat. And don't even think about ignoring the signal. That pillar is not a suggestion. It's the ultimate divine itinerary. If it moves and you stay, that's rebellion. If it doesn't move and you try to leave, that's also rebellion. Either way, it's not going to end well for your spiritual record. So you follow, every time. Whether you're rested or not, fed or not, emotionally stable or one wrong hymn away from collapse. People pretend it's majestic. "Look, the Lord is with us," someone whispers reverently. You nod politely while blinking through smoke-induced tears. Because yes, it is majestic. It's also loud, hot, and impossible to ignore. You've set up camp 12 times this week and unpacked the tabernacle so often you've started naming its parts out of spite. Here comes Gary the Golden Lampstand, again. And of course there's no warning. The cloud doesn't say, "Hey folks, heads up, we'll be moving around 2 a.m. Have your sandals ready." It just lifts. Whenever. And suddenly the whole camp erupts in chaos like a holy fire drill. Children screaming, animals wandering, elders trying to remember where they packed the incense. Meanwhile, Moses is somewhere out front, squinting into the flames like it's all part of a divine plan you're definitely not included in. You try to pray for peace, but the flickering fire outside your tent makes your eyelids twitch and your patience evaporate. Maybe this is the lesson: obedience in motion, faith in flexibility. Or maybe it's just spiritual jet lag stretched over 4 decades of relocation trauma. Either way, the fire is moving, again. And you, poor soul, are once again packing your life into a bundle and following the world's brightest nightlight into nowhere. At first, you thought this was just a rough patch in the journey. A brief detour, a divine scenic route. But then day 30 turned into day 300, and your group accidentally circled the same rock formation for the 5th time, and you realized something terrifying. You're not on your way anywhere. You're just wandering on purpose. Spiritually, of course. Welcome to God's ultimate test of endurance, where forward motion is symbolic and the actual destination is more of a rumor than a goal. People keep insisting, we're exactly where we're supposed to be. You look around at the featureless sand, the worn-out tents, the dried-out patience of everyone around you, and you try, really try, to believe that. But the truth is, you've lost all spatial awareness. If you ever did enter the promised land, you probably wouldn't recognize it without someone holding up a sign that says, "Congratulations, this is it." Moses keeps saying it's not about the map, it's about the transformation. Character, faith, trust. You're becoming holy, not directional. But you'd really just like to see a tree. A real one. With shade. Maybe a river. Maybe 2. You miss the concept of landmarks. You would give anything for a "you are here" sign, even if it only pointed to "still lost." The cloud and fire keep leading you, but never in a straight line. Sometimes north, sometimes south, sometimes back the way you came, and you start to suspect God's using your group to draw prophetic doodles in the sand. Your route looks less like a path to purpose and more like divine calligraphy with very little legibility. Some of the elders insist this is how God teaches dependence, that if you always knew where you were, you'd stop trusting the one who's leading, which sounds beautiful until you realize it means trusting a journey with zero visible progress, where your main accomplishment today was not tripping over your own despair. Others try to turn it into a metaphor. We're wandering in our hearts too, they say, and you nod while silently wondering how long it'll take before metaphorical wandering also gives you shin splints. The younger generation seems oddly fine with it, probably because they've never known anything else. This is their normal, but you remember the beginning. You remember the hope, the fire, the freedom. And now you're somewhere between spiritual numbness and permanent sand rash. Still, you wake up every day, you pack up camp, you follow the pillar, you walk, and walk, and walk, because to stop would be worse. To stop would mean you gave up, and deep down, under all the sarcasm and sunburn, a tiny sliver of you still believes. Maybe the next valley, maybe the next mountain, maybe tomorrow, something will change. You're not lost, not really. You're just being spiritually rerouted, forever. You're sitting in your tent, absolutely cooked by the sun and your own overthinking, when someone casually mentions that Aaron has made a decision. Again, and you already know, you just know, it's going to be the kind of priestly wisdom that feels less like leadership and more like getting lectured by someone who's never actually carried a water jar. Aaron, bless his holy robes, is full of authority and earnest expression. But the man's spiritual insights seem to drift somewhere between impractical and utterly infuriating. Remember the golden calf? Yeah, that was him. When Moses was up on Mount Sinai, having a private thunder and smoke session with God, Aaron was down below taking jewelry from impatient people and crafting it into an idol that set everyone back 40 years. And when Moses came storming down like a disappointed parent at a house party, Aaron's defense was basically, the gold jumped into the fire and turned into a calf. I have no idea how it happened. That's your high priest. That's the guy you're supposed to trust with holy matters. And yet, here he is, again, weighing in. Today, his latest announcement involves an elaborate ceremony to purify the camp from uncleanness. You're not against purification per se, but when the instructions include burning a red heifer and collecting its ashes for ritual sprinkling, you start to feel like you're the victim of a very niche performance art piece. You want to ask, Aaron, is this really what God wants? But then you remember he still carries a staff that sometimes blooms and sometimes summons plagues, so maybe keep that question to yourself. You try to listen respectfully, you really do. You sit in the circle with the others while Aaron talks about sacred garments and tabernacle order and how touching the wrong object will get you smoked. The rules are endless, complicated, and suspiciously vague at the worst moments. Aaron insists it's all about drawing closer to God, but to you it feels more like walking barefoot through a field of invisible landmines. You want to follow the instructions, but also, do you need a separate goat for every sin or just the big ones? And don't even think about asking a clarifying question. Aaron's whole vibe is trusted mouthpiece of God, which leaves very little room for nuance or, practical concerns like what if accidentally brushed against a corpse while sneezing. You try not to be bitter. He's Moses' brother. He didn't ask for this either. But sometimes you wish the priestly hotline to heaven came with a little more clarity and a lot fewer livestock casualties. Aaron means well, probably, but his idea of leadership feels like an endless maze of incense, robes, and ceremonial ambiguity. You're not mad, just tired. Tired of being told the incense was off by half a pinch and now you're unclean until sundown. Tired of rules you can't see and rituals that somehow always involve your last sheep. You'll follow, because what else can you do? But if Aaron ever says, God told me, again, you might just fake a nosebleed and walk into the desert. So there you were, minding your own business, waiting patiently at the bottom of the mountain while Moses had a one-on-one meeting with the Almighty, when someone had the brilliant idea, hey, let's melt down our earrings and make a cow. And because groupthink is a powerful thing, next thing you knew, Aaron was collecting jewelry, a fire was blazing, and voila, a golden calf, fresh from the forge and already ruining your spiritual future. You didn't even want the calf. You just wanted something to focus on, something visible, tangible. After all, Moses had been gone for weeks, and no one knew if he was coming back. There was thunder, smoke, and ominous silence. People were panicking. And apparently, when people panic in the wilderness, they make livestock-shaped idols and call it worship. The logic wasn't great, but the crowd was loud, and the jewelry was shiny. The calf itself was underwhelming. A squat little statue that glittered just enough to distract you from how truly bad the idea was. But by then it was too late. People were dancing, singing, offering sacrifices. It started feeling like a block party with a deeply concerning theological twist. And then Moses came back. You've never seen someone that angry without bursting into flames. He descended the mountain like a human thunderstorm, carrying stone tablets etched by the literal finger of God. And when he saw the calf, smash. The tablets were shattered, the party ended instantly, and suddenly you remembered what fear of the Lord actually felt like. And Aaron? The man responsible, he offered up the most unconvincing excuse in spiritual history. I threw the gold into the fire, and out came this calf. Really, Aaron? Really? What followed was not just correction, it was divine fury. Levites drew swords. People died. The covenant was jeopardized. God wanted to wipe everyone out and start over with Moses. And you were just standing there holding a half-eaten loaf of unleavened bread, wondering how your day had taken such a horrifying turn. From that moment on, nothing was the same. God still led you, still fed you, still forgave you. But the relationship changed. The tone changed. The journey, which was already difficult, suddenly became soaked in consequences. What could have been a 2-week pilgrimage turned into 40 years of dust, doubt, and daily doses of discipline. You still hear whispers about the calf. It comes up in sermons, in arguments, in side glances whenever anything starts to feel too joyful, like if the music gets too upbeat during worship, someone quietly mutters, "Let's not have another golden calf situation." And just like that, the joy vanishes. You didn't even dance that day. But it doesn't matter. The calf was collective. The consequences communal. You learned something important though. When people don't wait well, they build gods out of glitter, and sometimes those gods follow you longer than you ever danced around them. At first you thought holiness was just a state of heart. Be kind, stay humble, pray a lot, keep the complaining to a minimum. Simple, manageable. But then the scrolls came out, and suddenly holiness is a full-time job with a subclause about mildew, a 3-goat purification system, and an entire chapter on what to do if your clay pot gets contaminated. You try to keep up, you really do. But it's not holiness anymore, it's spiritual algebra, and you're failing the class. One of the priests hands you a list. It's written in a language that feels like it was invented specifically to confuse you. There's a section on bodily fluids that makes you deeply uncomfortable. A paragraph on the exact ingredients required to make sacred anointing oil, and a warning that if you try to DIY it, you die. and something about not wearing clothing woven of two kinds of fabric. So yes, your tunic is a sin. Probably. Moses reads the laws aloud at the center of camp, while everyone listens with wide eyes and increasing dread. The rules just keep coming. Every time you think, okay, got it, don't eat blood, a new rule pops up about avoiding shellfish, trimming your beard wrong, or making sure your goat isn't too friendly with your ox. You start to feel like maybe holiness is less about being close to God and more about surviving without accidentally touching something unclean. And speaking of unclean, no one actually knows what it means anymore. It doesn't mean sinful, apparently, but it doesn't not mean sinful. It's a weird grey area where one wrong move, say sitting in the wrong tent, brushing against the wrong blanket, or having a skin rash that looks a little too suspicious, can leave you exiled for a week and purified with bird blood and hyssop. You now live in constant fear of mould. The priests assure you this is all for your protection, that these laws create a community where God's presence can safely dwell. You nod, you agree, you respect the process, but internally, you're one goat sacrifice away from a nervous breakdown. You're just trying to make it through the day without breaking Rule 143B about bringing unauthorized fire near the altar, which, by the way, killed 2 guys last week. They were priests, actual trained priests, gone, vaporized. You haven't lit anything since. Every time you think you're doing okay, someone points out you forgot to wash after touching your mat, or that you were in proximity to someone who may have looked sideways at a carcass. And you're like, what even is holy anymore? But you say nothing, because saying the wrong thing is probably also unholy. Holiness, it turns out, is not about perfection. It's about awareness, attention, reverence. It's exhausting, yes. Confusing, absolutely. But somewhere in the middle of all these obscure instructions, you start to realize God's not asking for polish. He's asking for presence. And sometimes that means checking your clothes for mold before morning prayer. You thought you'd finally caught a break. After weeks, no, months, of chewing on the same bland manna, someone started whispering about meat. Real meat, not spiritual metaphors or man does not live by bread alone, pep talks, actual feathered, protein-packed flesh. You don't want to get your hopes up, but the air shifts, the mood changes, and then suddenly, quail, everywhere, like a poultry apocalypse. They drop from the sky in swarms. The ground is covered. It's raining bird. And the people, they lose their minds. You'd think salvation had come in the form of a small, confused chicken. You grab your tunic, start scooping, yelling to your neighbour to bring a basket, a bowl, a blanket, anything to catch the falling miracle. Quail storms don't happen every day. You're laughing, you're crying, you're daydreaming about roasted thighs and crispy skin and maybe, dare you hope, flavour. But here's the thing, nobody asked any questions, nobody paused, nobody said, should we maybe wait and see if there's a catch? Everyone dove in like this was divine room service, and the tip had already been paid. By nightfall, the camp smells like a fried animal convention. People are roasting, boiling, stuffing their faces. It's a feast, a frenzy, a full-on meat revival. And then, the groaning starts. At first, it's subtle. A few people hunched over their tents, a slow crawl to the edges of the camp. Then more, then louder. You hear retching in stereo, people clutching their stomachs, calling out to God, regretting every bite they just inhaled like a spiritualized competitive eater. Turns out, when you eat meat in bulk after a steady diet of fluff flakes, your digestive system doesn't exactly say thank you. Also, minor detail. God wasn't thrilled about how everyone demanded meat like entitled toddlers at a banquet. There was a tone, a very whiny, very ungrateful tone. So yes, the quail was a miracle, but it was also a test, one that, unsurprisingly, everyone failed with enthusiastic chewing. Moses, of course, is not having a good day. He tried to warn everyone. He even asked God to smite him instead of forcing him to lead another meal prep meltdown. But now he's got a camp full of nauseous people, an atmosphere of paltry regret, and a reputation as the guy who brought us out to die with meat in our mouths. You sit quietly, rocking back and forth, wondering how something that tasted so right could go so catastrophically wrong. Your stomach is trying to kill you. Your spirit is curled into a corner. and you swear if you ever see another bird again, you'll just nod politely and walk the other way. Lesson learned? Maybe. Or maybe tomorrow you'll be back out there with a net, hoping the next miracle comes without side effects. You were just trying to express yourself. That's it. A little feedback, a gentle suggestion, a heartfelt, "This is miserable and I hate everything." But apparently, in the wilderness, that counts as rebellion. Because somewhere between grumbling about the sand in your food and questioning Moses' latest GPS update, you accidentally committed a spiritual crime, one that comes with consequences, like fire or plagues, or waking up to find your tent smoking, not metaphorically. At this point, complaining is practically a sport. Everyone does it. Some people whisper it, others mutter it loud enough for Moses to hear and roll his eyes in 30 different languages. But the truth is, you've gotten really good at it. You've refined the art. You can complain in metaphors, in song, in synchronized eye rolls with your tent neighbor. Your discontent has layers now, textured, nuanced, tragically poetic. And why wouldn't you complain? It's hot, it's endless, the food is repetitive, the rules are confusing, the water is unpredictable, the leadership is stressed, and every time you ask a basic question like, "Hey, are we even close to the promised land?" someone tells you to have faith and eat more manna. But here's the twist. God's listening. Like really listening. Not in a cute, "tell me how you feel, child" way. In a "keep talking and I will literally light the outskirts of the camp on fire" kind of way. You didn't know that at first. You thought complaining was just part of the wilderness experience. Turns out, heaven has receipts, and a zero-tolerance policy for spiritual tantrums. The worst part, you can't even stop. You want to stop. You try to be grateful. You start the day with good intentions. "Today, I will say nothing negative." But then someone steals your water jug. The sun feels like it's chewing your skin, and Moses is late again with the direction update. And before you know it, bam, you're muttering about how Egypt had better bread and at least Pharaoh gave you onions. The elders keep saying things like, "Trust is a discipline and contentment is learned in suffering." You nod, you appreciate the wisdom, but inside, you're still irritated that your spiritual journey includes this much sweating and zero seating. At night, when the stars come out and the camp finally quiets down, you lie in your tent and reflect. You feel guilty. Kind of. You don't want to be this person. But you also don't want to pretend everything's fine when it clearly isn't. And that's the tension. Being honest without being ungrateful. Being real without being consumed by frustration. So maybe you'll try again tomorrow. Fewer complaints, more trust. Maybe one less sarcastic comment during morning prayers. Baby steps, because apparently, in the wilderness, growth isn't measured by distance. It's measured by how much whining you can resist before God sets something on fire. You wake up to the sound of murmuring again and discover that Moses is gone, not gone, just up the mountain again, which has become a euphemism for no one's really in charge and everyone's about to lose their spiritual minds. This is, the third time he's wandered up into the clouds for a divine download, and every time he does, things on the ground go sideways faster than you can say, "Where's Aaron?" Speaking of Aaron, guess who's holding the staff now? That's right. Mr. I accidentally made a golden calf himself. Somehow, in Moses' absence, Aaron always becomes the default leader, which is like handing the keys to your house to a raccoon who once tried to burn it down. He means well, he tries, but delegation is not the same as direction, and it shows. Immediately, the camp loses its structure. One guy thinks he's in charge of food rations now. Another starts interpreting dreams and assigning symbolic meanings to tent placement. The Levites are arguing about incense again. And everyone else? They're just waiting. Bored. It's too quiet without Moses yelling at people for trying to store manna in clay jars again. The silence is unnerving. People get weird when there's no yelling. You want to believe Aaron has it under control. He's got the priestly garments, the rituals memorized, and access to sacred oils. But the man could be dressed in a literal cloud of glory and still somehow allow a golden idol into the mix. His leadership style is mostly damage control. You'd ask him for direction, but he's currently locked in a debate with 3 elders over whether someone's rash qualifies as unclean or just unfortunate. And then there's the people. Without Moses around, the whole camp becomes one big suggestion box. Everyone has ideas. Everyone thinks their way is better. Someone's chanting about building a backup altar. Someone else is sketching redesigns for the tabernacle with more airflow. And there's a group in the corner quietly forming a new committee called People for Immediate Entry into the Promised Land, with or without Moses. Meanwhile, you're just trying to survive. You stick to your routine. Gather manna, avoid drama, pray quietly, don't die. But it's hard when everyone's walking around with barely concealed panic and too much free time. You keep glancing at the mountain, wondering what's taking so long. Did Moses get lost? Did God ask him to build something again? Or is this just another spiritual timeout for a prophet on the edge? Eventually, smoke starts rising from the peak. A good sign? Maybe. Or maybe God's just as irritated as the rest of you. One thing's clear. When Moses leaves camp, everything spirals. Holiness goes on hiatus. Boundaries blur. Leadership gets shaky. And you start to remember why God doesn't usually do group projects. There are a lot of things you're not supposed to do in the wilderness. Work on the Sabbath, complain too much, get too curious about mildew. But if there's one rule that's burned into your soul now, it's this. Don't touch the Ark of the Covenant. Seriously. Don't look at it too long. Don't breathe too close. Don't even think about steadying it if it wobbles. It doesn't matter how noble your intentions are. Touch the Ark, and you'll be vaporized before you can blink. Everyone knows the rule. It's been repeated, chanted, drilled into your head like a spiritual fire drill. The Ark is holy. It's where God's presence sits. And it comes with instructions so specific, it makes the manna handling regulations look casual. Only Levites can carry it. On poles, not by hand, and never under any circumstances should you lay a finger on it. But rules are only as strong as the heat of the moment. One day, mid-journey, the ground shifts. The oxen pulling the cart stumble. The ark sways, just slightly. And you, helpful, well-meaning you, reach out. Reflex, instinct, whatever, just to steady it, just a gentle touch, and then you're gone. Not fainted, not scolded, gone. Ashes on the ground where your body used to be. One moment, a concerned member of the community. The next, a cautionary tale. People scream. Moses drops to his knees. The whole camp goes silent, except for the wind moving through the trees like it's trying to warn everyone else. Don't follow that example. You didn't mean to be irreverent. You weren't mocking God. You weren't rebelling. You were trying to help. But that's the point. The Ark isn't just a box with tablets and manna inside. It's the physical seat of divine presence. And holiness is not casual. It's not flexible. It's not something you can manage on your terms. Everyone mourns. There's a ceremony. Moses says some words. But the message is crystal clear. God is not to be handled. Even with good intentions, even in moments of panic, even when you think you're doing the right thing, there's a line, and the Ark is the line. The story spreads like wildfire. You become a warning, a whisper, a lesson wrapped in silence. Every child in the camp knows your name, not because you were brave, because you forgot the boundary. So now, the Ark moves only when it must, only on poles, only by priests, no shortcuts, no substitutions. And every time someone even glances at it, they think of you, the one who reached out and didn't come back. 1 minute, Korah's standing at the edge of the camp, chest puffed out, voice rising, arms raised like he's finally saying what everyone's been too afraid to admit. Who put Moses in charge? Aren't we all holy? Isn't God with all of us? It sounds bold, convincing even. People nod. You nod. Because deep down, a part of you has wondered the same. Why Moses? Why Aaron? Why not someone else for once? The next minute, the ground splits open like it's had enough of the conversation. You don't even have time to scream. Korah and his entire crew, gone, swallowed. The earth opens, breathes once, and seals shut as if nothing ever happened. Silence falls across the camp, the kind of silence that only shows up when reality shifts and nobody knows if they're next. You stand frozen, blinking at the patch of dirt that just consumed your neighbour. You shared bread with him last week. He helped you fix your tent pole. Now there's nothing but dust, and the lingering echo of defiance. You feel the judgment hang in the air like smoke from an invisible fire. No one speaks. No one moves. Somewhere off to the side, a child starts to cry and their mother hushes them like sound alone might trigger another crack in the ground. Moses doesn't gloat. He doesn't even look relieved. Just older, worn down, like one more argument might break him harder than any plague ever could. You think about what Korah said, about equality, about leadership, about shared holiness, and you realize it wasn't the questions that got him swallowed. It was the spirit behind them, the entitlement, the arrogance masked as righteousness, the refusal to submit to something bigger than his own sense of justice. This isn't about agreeing or disagreeing. It's about reverence, about knowing when to speak and when to kneel. And in the wilderness, humility isn't optional. It's survival. People slowly disperse, walking quietly back to their tents, heads low, eyes scanning the earth beneath them like it might blink again. That patch of dirt where Korah stood becomes sacred ground, untouched, unspoken of, avoided with a reverent shuffle. You find yourself whispering your prayers tonight. Not out of fear exactly, but out of clarity. This journey isn't just about escaping Egypt or reaching the Promised Land. It's about being reshaped in the fire of obedience, even when it's confusing, even when it's terrifying, even when the price of pride is a crater and a memory that no one dares to explain. The stone tablets were heavy, sure, but at least they were manageable. 10 rules, straightforward, clear. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, don't cheat on your spouse or carve idols out of shiny stuff. You could live with that. You could write it on the side of your tent and check it every morning. But then came the rest. Not 10, not 20, 613. You stare blankly at the scroll as a scribe reads out today's batch of new commandments. You lose track somewhere around law number 42, something about tassels on garments and not boiling a goat in its mother's milk. That one haunts you. Not because you'd planned to do it, but because now it's a thing you have to remember not to do, as if the list assumes you're casually mixing milk and goat for fun. The rules cover everything. Your clothes, your meals, your sleep, your thoughts, how to treat mold on your walls, how to shave, how to bury your waste, what kind of fabric can touch your skin, and how long you're unclean if you sneeze near a corpse. There are instructions for how to rest. Even your rest has rules now. And the kicker? Breaking them doesn't just mean a slap on the wrist. It means ritual purification. It means sacrifices. It means long conversations with your local priest, and possibly holding a pigeon upside down while reciting psalms of repentance. You want to ask who's keeping score. You want to believe some of these are symbolic. But no one's laughing, not even the Levites. You try to keep a cheat sheet. You draw little symbols to remember what goes with what. But even your cheat sheet now needs a glossary. And one misstep, one oversight, boom, unclean, again. You overhear someone asking if there's a master list. A master list. You imagine Moses rolling his eyes so hard he sees the inside of Sinai. The list is life now. It is the walk through the wilderness. It's the scaffolding holding this fragile community together in the absence of walls, governments, or a land to call home. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the laws are the shape of a people being reformed, a nation being carved, line by line, into something that can carry divine presence without combusting. Maybe the chaos of the rules is meant to force constant awareness of your body, your choices, your words, your neighbour. Still, part of you longs for a simpler time, just you, the tablets, and a quiet afternoon under a tree. But in this desert, there are no trees, just dust, commandments, and the unshakable feeling that if you ever do make it to the Promised Land, you're bringing all 613 laws with you, whether you like it or not. They walk by you in slow, measured steps, robes swaying, heads held high, faces unreadable. You nod in respect like everyone else, but something about them makes you uneasy. It's not their silence. It's not even the solemn way they never make eye contact. It's the smell, the thick, clinging scent of smoke, not the sweet kind from campfires or incense. This is heavier, sharper, like something that used to be alive got caught in a holy furnace. You've stopped asking questions about the priests. They're everywhere, sprinkling blood, waving censers, muttering prayers under their breath in a language only they seem to fully understand. At first you found it fascinating, mysterious, sacred. But now it feels like they've seen something you never will, something they won't talk about. You remember Nadab and Abihu, two of Aaron's sons, trained, anointed, fully robed, and then gone, just like that. They offered unauthorized fire, whatever that means, and the next moment they were a memory, consumed in an instant. No warning, no explanation. 1 second, priests, the next, ashes. The smoke hasn't cleared since. The rest of the priesthood didn't speak about it much. No memorials, no eulogies, just silence and stricter rules. More precision. You don't dare ask what unauthorized means anymore. You just assume everything is. And so the priests walk by with that faint smell clinging to them, like a warning baked into their skin. They carry weight beyond their duties. They bear the sins of the people, and you're starting to think it's not just a metaphor. You've seen the way they look after a particularly rough day at the altar. Hunched shoulders, distant eyes, robes stained and hands trembling as they clean up the remains of someone else's forgiveness. You wonder what it does to a soul, being the one to constantly mediate the mess of others. You wonder what it feels like to stand that close to the holy and survive. But you also wonder what it cost them. You've started avoiding the tabernacle. Not because you don't believe, but because you do. Because every time you hear the sound of a ram's horn or see the flicker of fire on the altar, your heart races like it knows something your mind isn't ready to admit. This is dangerous. Sacred, yes, but not safe. Not soft, not something to trifle with. So you keep your head low when the priests pass. You give them space. You speak carefully. Because whatever they've touched, whatever they carry, you're not sure you'd survive it. And as that smoky scent trails behind them, you remember again, holiness isn't something you wear, it's something that burns. You thought you were doing the right thing. Resting, recharging, being holy in the way people keep reminding you to be. Honor the Sabbath, they say. Keep it holy. So you did. You laid down early, skipped your usual chores, even passed on the extra helping of manna to avoid gathering too much. You were on it, until you weren't. It started small. A thread came loose on your sandal. No big deal, right? You reached for some twine to fix it. Technically not work, just maintenance. Then your neighbour's pot tipped over and spilled water across the floor of the tent. Instinct kicked in. You mopped it up with a cloth. Again, not labour, just preventing a mud situation. But by the time someone pointed at you and whispered, "It's the Sabbath," your stomach dropped like a stone. Now you're that person, the one who broke the sacred day by existing a little too efficiently. You thought the Sabbath was a gift, a chance to breathe, to reflect, to stretch your legs without the pressure of the journey. But the rules wrapped around it are so intricate you feel like you need a legal team just to sit still. You're not supposed to light fires, or gather wood, or cook, or walk too far, or carry anything, or even think too hard about anything that might involve motion, weight, or responsibility. And yet, somehow, it's still your job to be spiritually productive while physically inert. The tension is exhausting. You want to honor it. You really do. You want to observe this pause like it means something more than empty ritual. But every time you move, someone raises an eyebrow. Every time you shift in your seat, you're afraid it might count as toiling. You heard what happened to the last guy who gathered wood on the Sabbath. He wasn't warned. He wasn't forgiven. He was stoned to death. By the community. Publicly. And that's all the warning you need. So now, you sit very still. Very careful. And try not to fidget. The weird part? It is beautiful. There's a quiet that settles over the camp on Sabbath that nothing else brings. A softness. A breath in the midst of non-stop struggle. People speak gently. The dust feels less invasive. Even the sun seems more forgiving. But underneath that peace is a thin layer of dread. Because when the day ends, you feel relieved. Not because you're ready to go back to work, but because you survived the stillness without sinning. The Sabbath is a gift, a holy rhythm, a moment carved out of chaos. But it's also a test, a reminder that rest isn't just doing nothing. It's choosing to trust that doing nothing might still be enough. It started with a meeting. Not a rebellion, yet. Just a few guys with big voices and even bigger opinions. Korah led it, of course. He always does. Loud, confident, charming in the way that makes you second-guess your own doubts. "Aren't we all holy?" he asked, with that smile like he was doing you a favor by including you in the conversation. "Why should Moses and Aaron get all the authority? We all hear from God." And there it was, the sentence that turned a theological debate into a seismic event. You didn't disagree with Korah, not completely. You'd wondered the same in quieter moments. Weren't you chosen too? Didn't you leave Egypt like everyone else, walk through the sea, eat the manna, carry the burdens? Why did a few men wear the robes and hold the incense while everyone else sat on the sidelines? It made sense, until it didn't. Moses, to his credit, didn't argue. He fell face down, the way he always does when things are about to go sideways. He told Korah and his followers to show up the next morning with censers, offering incense to see whom God would choose. And that's when you should have backed out, right then. But you didn't. The next morning, the sun rose like nothing was wrong. You stood behind Korah's crowd, arms crossed, watching incense curl up into the sky. Maybe, for a second, you even hoped God would say, "Yes, all of you, you're right. Let's redistribute the holiness." Instead, Moses warned everyone to step back, clear the area, don't touch their tents. You watched people scramble away. The silence was heavy, too still. Then the ground opened. Just like that. One loud, terrible sound, and the earth tore itself apart under Korah's camp. Gone. Not wounded, not punished. Gone. Swallowed whole. You couldn't move. You couldn't think. The same mouth that declared, "We're holy too," now filled with dust. Your knees buckled before your pride did. You weren't even sure what you believed anymore, only that you didn't want to stand that close to the edge ever again. After that, incense didn't smell the same. You didn't ask questions the same way, and every time someone brought up fairness or spiritual equality, you felt your stomach knot, because it wasn't that God didn't love everyone. It was that holiness, real, weighty holiness, comes with fire, not flattery. It's not claimed. It's given, and only some survive it. You still believe you're chosen, but you've learned to stop demanding proof. Not because you're afraid of being wrong, but because now you understand just how dangerous it is to be right for the wrong reasons. You don't know how long it's been. Days blur into each other. The sun rises and sets like clockwork, but your body doesn't register the rhythm anymore. Your feet are sore, your eyes sting from sand, and your hope, once vibrant and eager, is beginning to crack like the ground beneath your sandals. You keep asking, how much farther? No one has a straight answer. Not Moses, not the elders, not even the cloud that's supposed to guide you, which seems to stop and start on its own confusing schedule. Sometimes it hovers for days. Other times it lifts in the middle of the night, as if testing how committed you really are to this whole trust God thing. You left Egypt with a fire in your chest, freedom, promise, destiny. But now, as you shuffle through your third desert in as many months, carrying a jug of water and a heavy silence, you can't help but wonder if this journey has a destination, or if wandering is the destination itself. The people are tired too. You can see it in the way they move, slow and cautious, like any moment could be their last step. Conversations have grown quieter. Fewer songs, fewer stories. Even the children play with less energy, their laughter swallowed by wind and dust. The air is dry, and so is the joy. Still, you move forward, one foot, then the next. Not because it feels good, but because turning back feels worse. Egypt is long behind you. What's ahead is still invisible. All you have is this moment, this mile, this breath. Moses tries to encourage you, bless him. He talks about the land flowing with milk and honey. He reminds you of God's promises, of the covenant, of the future your children will inherit. But it's hard to picture vineyards and rivers when your lips are cracked and your water skin is nearly empty. You've learned not to expect ease. You've learned that faith doesn't always look like soaring strength. Sometimes it looks like limping in silence. Sometimes it looks like getting up, even when the only thing that changed is the direction of the wind. And strangely, that's where you meet God the most. Not in the grand miracles, not in the parted seas or fire on the mountain, but in the quiet march, in the gritty, slow, ordinary faith of waking up and walking again. You're tired, you're dusty, you're still not there yet. But maybe that's not failure. Maybe it's what wilderness is supposed to be, the stretch between slavery and freedom, filled with enough tension to shape you into something that can carry the promise without dropping it. You survived Egypt. You survived the plagues. You crossed the sea, ate the manna, watched people get swallowed by the earth, and somehow didn't die of boredom during the 100th repetition of the purity laws. So when the camp finally started moving again, you thought, maybe, just maybe, you were done being tested. Wrong. The wilderness doesn't ease up just because you've been faithful. In fact, the more faithful you try to be, the more intense the lessons seem to get. You're not just being led anymore, you're being refined. Which sounds beautiful in theory, but in practice, it feels a lot like barely surviving. You thought passing one test earned you a break, like school. Learn the lesson, take the quiz, get a sticker. But here, it's more like God saw your C+ in trust and decided it was time for the next level. No study guide, no warning. Just a sudden change in direction, a dried up well, and a cloud that drifts into unfamiliar territory with terrifying confidence. This time, the test comes wrapped in silence. God stops speaking through Moses for days. No instructions, no updates, just dust and dry wind. You begin wondering if he's still paying attention, or if he's letting you walk in circles to see what's actually in your heart. Spoiler, it's not great. Impatience, frustration, suspicion, they bubble up quickly. You try to pray, but your prayers sound more like complaints disguised in polite phrasing. You try to wait, but the waiting makes you restless. You try to encourage others, but your voice cracks, and you end up sounding like someone who's half believing the things they're saying. And then the real test hits. Someone gets bitten, then another, then 10. Serpents, out of nowhere, slithering through camp, biting ankles and wrists, leaving poison in their wake. Panic erupts. People scream, run, collapse. You cry out, "Why now? Haven't we been through enough?" That's when it hits you. This is the test. Not the snakes, not the silence, but how you respond. Do you harden, despair, blame, or do you look up at the bronze serpent Moses raises on a pole and believe that healing is possible in the middle of pain? God wasn't done testing you, not because he's cruel, but because the promised land can't be carried by people who still flinch at hardship. The wilderness isn't just about where you're going, it's about who you're becoming. So you keep walking, heart pounding, eyes open, spirit trembling but still breathing. You're not the same as you were in Egypt. You're not even the same as last week. You're being tested, still, but maybe that's the point. It happens quietly. No thunder, no earthquake, no dramatic showdown with rebels or fire from heaven. Just a walk up the mountain, Moses, Aaron, and Eleazar. 3 men go up, 2 come down. You stand at the edge of camp, staring up at the peak. You don't see what happens up there, but you feel it. The stillness, the shift, the way the air changes when something eternal touches something mortal. When Moses returns, he's not speaking. Eleazar follows, wearing his father's priestly garments. And Aaron's gone. Gone. And that's when it hits you, not like a lightning bolt, but like water rising slowly around your feet. This man, this flawed, tired, soft-spoken man who's been with you since Egypt, is no longer here. And suddenly your eyes are wet and you're not sure when that started. You didn't expect to care this much. Aaron wasn't perfect. He had that whole golden calf incident. He waffled under pressure. He was quieter than Moses, less dramatic than the plagues, and not nearly as terrifying as the voice of God from the mountain. But he was there, steady, reliable, human. He was the one who held trembling hands over the altar when people came with guilt too heavy to carry alone. He was the voice praying softly when your words ran dry. He knew your name, your story. He remembered what Egypt felt like. He walked through the Red Sea beside you, and now he's buried on a mountain, wrapped in silence, and you didn't get to say goodbye. The whole camp mourns for 30 days. Not a command, not a suggestion, a need, because Aaron was more than a priest. He was the quiet thread holding together all the people who never felt holy enough to stand before fire. Without him, it feels like there's a crack in the foundation. Eleazar steps into the role, his face still swollen from tears. He wears the garments now, he performs the duties, but he doesn't carry the same weight in your heart, yet. Not because he's unworthy, but because grief doesn't transfer with titles. In those days of mourning, you realize something else. Loss is part of the journey too. It's not just about walking toward a promise, it's about carrying the memory of those who didn't finish the path. Those who paved it with quiet faith and fragile courage. You whisper Aaron's name during evening prayers. You light no fire. You make no declarations. You just sit and grieve and remember, because the wilderness isn't just testing your strength, it's shaping your heart. And sometimes becoming the people of God means learning how to keep walking with a limp. You should have known better. That little sarcastic comment under your breath, the muttered complaint about Moses, the food, the heat, the endless dust in every fold of your clothes. Yeah, that one. Turns out heaven hears everything. And this time, instead of fire or plague or a speech from Moses that lasts half the afternoon, God sent snakes. Literal, hissing, slithering, vengeful snakes. It starts with a scream, then another. You rush toward the noise only to stop short as you see what's slithering between the tents. Serpents, dozens of them, weaving like divine judgment with fangs. Someone yells, someone collapses, and then you feel it. A sharp stab in your ankle. You've been bitten. And the worst part? You know why. You weren't exactly leading a rebellion. You were just tired. Tired of manna, tired of walking, tired of Moses' vague directions and God's delayed promises. You didn't mean to start anything. You just needed to vent. Maybe roll your eyes. Maybe throw in a complaint or two about how cucumbers in Egypt were at least real and didn't fall from the sky with a side of guilt. But now your legs swelling, your vision's blurring, and the snakes aren't leaving. They just keep coming. People drop like flies. You crawl into the shadow of your tent, trying to breathe, trying not to cry. You want to be mad at God, but deep down, you know this one's on you. You let your bitterness bloom too far. You let your discontent fester until it smelled more like pride than pain. Moses does what Moses always does. He pleads, intercedes, lays his face in the dirt and begs God to spare the people again. And God, in a twist only he could think up, tells Moses to build a bronze serpent, set it on a pole and raise it high in the middle of the camp. Anyone who looks at it, Moses says, will live. You blink. That's it? Just look. You drag yourself out of your corner. Crawl, limping, hand trembling. You raise your eyes to the glint of metal shimmering in the heat. One long, aching glance, and something shifts, not instantly, but enough to breathe again. The snakes don't vanish. The wilderness doesn't change. But the venom stops spreading. The heat in your veins begins to cool. You live. And as you sit in the dirt, catching your breath, you realize this was never about the snakes. It was about the poison already in your heart, the slow drip of pride, resentment, entitlement. The serpent just exposed it. You won't forget that bite, or the mercy that followed it. It was just water. That's all you needed. Not a miracle, not a thunderclap, just water. You were thirsty, again, and so was everyone else. The animals were groaning. The children were crying. Even the elders were blinking slow and dry-eyed like they'd given up pretending to be hopeful. So yes, tempers were a little high. And yes, maybe people were starting to question Moses. Again. And that's when it happened. Moses stormed out of the tent of meeting. Face flushed, jaw tight, staff in hand. God had told him, speak to the rock, not hit, not threaten, not scold the people into repentance. Just speak. A calm instruction for a weary prophet, a gentle moment of provision. But Moses was tired. You could see it. Years of complaints, disobedience, mutiny, and sand in his shoes had worn him down. So instead of speaking, he shouted, "Listen, you rebels!" And then, whack, staff to stone, once, twice. Water came, sure, a flood of it, more than enough. People cheered, drank, laughed, but something in the air shifted, not joy, not relief, something colder, heavier, and then the words came, low and final. "Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy, you will not bring this assembly into the land I am giving them." Wait, what? After everything? The Red Sea, the plagues, the mountain, the endless wilderness? Because of one moment, one strike? Yes, because this wasn't about the rock, it was about representation, about what it means to stand between the people and the presence. When Moses struck the rock in anger, he told a full story about God. He made the holy seem furious. He made grace look like a tantrum. And in doing so, he crossed a line that can't be undone with an apology. You watched Moses stagger under the weight of that judgment. Not a fireball, not a public execution, just a sentence quietly spoken and heavy as the mountain. And suddenly you saw the danger not just in disobedience, but in misrepresenting God's heart, in letting your own wounds bleed into your leadership, in speaking when you should have paused, in striking when you should have listened. You lower your eyes. You've been there, tired, fed up, swinging instead of speaking. You wonder how often you've distorted grace because you couldn't hold space for it. Water flowed, the people survived, but something was lost that day. A door closed for Moses, and if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. So now, when the rocks sit silent in the sun, you think twice before lifting your hand. Balaam looked the part. Prophetic, powerful, paid well. The kind of guy who didn't travel without a retinue and a polished speech about divine insight. He had access, he had status, and when the king of Moab asked him to curse Israel, Balaam didn't say no. He said he'd pray about it. Classic. You watched from a distance as messengers came and went, gold exchanged hands, and words like revelation and permission were tossed around like bargaining chips. Balaam said he'd only speak what God allowed him to speak, but deep down, everyone knew he wanted to go, not for mission, for money. So he saddled his donkey and set off, ready to impress, ready to sell a prophecy or two, ready to prove he could balance divine obedience with a healthy payout. But God saw the heart beneath the robes, and instead of striking Balaam down mid-ride, he did something better. He sent an angel, not to Balaam, to the donkey. The donkey saw what Balaam couldn't, a warrior angel standing in the road, sword drawn. So the donkey stopped, refused to move, turned aside, crushed Balaam's foot against a wall trying to avoid the invisible. And what did Balaam do? He beat her, over and over. And then the donkey spoke. Yes, spoke. "Why are you beating me? Have I ever acted like this before?" You'd think a talking donkey would humble a man, make him pause, reconsider his life choices. But Balaam, he argues with her, like it's normal, like divine intervention via livestock is just a minor inconvenience. Eventually, God opens Balaam's eyes. He sees the angel, he collapses, he gets the message. But the moment's already burned into your mind. A man who thought he was the mouthpiece of God had to be corrected by an animal. It's funny, until you realize how often you've done the same, charging ahead with your own plans, claiming divine direction, ignoring obstacles. And when something slows you down, blame it, fight it, curse it. Never once stopping to ask, what if this interruption is grace? The donkey wasn't rebellious. She was obedient, more so than her master. She saw what the prophet didn't. And that's the irony, the spiritually blind being led by the humble, the self-important being corrected by the overlooked. You don't walk the same after that story. You listen differently. You stop assuming your clarity equals God's blessing, and you start paying attention to the low, quiet signs. Because sometimes the truth you need won't come from thunder or tablets, but from a donkey with a bruised foot and a better view. You can see it. From the ridge where Moses stands, arm outstretched, there it is. Green, soft hills rolling into valleys. Real trees that aren't thorn bushes. Rivers that glimmer instead of vanish. Cities you didn't build but were promised anyway. You squint through the heat and try to imagine what milk and honey even taste like after decades of manna and dust. This is the moment, the finish line. The dream every tired footstep has been dragging toward. But then you hear the words, "You will see the land from a distance, but you will not enter it." Wait, what? Moses, the man who stared down Pharaoh, climbed Sinai, wept, fasted, pleaded for your life, and carried this fractious group of sunburned wanderers across literal wilderness, is not going in. The man who split the sea spoke to God face to face and endured more whining than any human should ever bear. He doesn't get to enter? Nope. He gets to see it. That's it. A view, a glimpse, a heartbreaking reminder that sometimes faith is about carrying a promise you won't live to experience. You watch him. He doesn't beg this time, doesn't argue, just stands there, silent, eyes fixed on the future that no longer includes him. He knows. This is the consequence of that moment at the rock, when frustration won out over faith, when he struck instead of spoke, when he misrepresented the God he served so faithfully for so long. And suddenly, the promised land feels heavier. Not just a reward, but a responsibility. Not just a destination, but a calling that comes with cost. You look at your own journey differently now. All those years you assumed arrival would mean peace, ease, a break from testing. You were wrong. This land, this gift, will demand even more of you. And now you'll have to face it without the man who's led you through every crisis. Moses turns to Joshua, hands him the mantle, says things like, "Be strong and courageous," as if courage could be passed down with a phrase. But Joshua nods, shoulders squared, eyes forward. You feel something shift in the camp, mourning mixed with anticipation, fear wrapped in promise, a door closing and another creaking open. And you stand there, caught between grief and destiny. You wonder what it means to inherit something you didn't fight for, but were shaped for. What it means to walk forward knowing someone else carried the weight that brought you here. Moses doesn't enter the land, but he enters the story, permanently, and the rest is up to you. It looked easy enough on the map. Just a river, not the Red Sea, not a mountain, not even enemy territory. Just water between where you are and where you're going. And compared to everything you've already survived, Egypt, snakes, plagues, a whole generation dropping dead in the desert, you figured crossing the Jordan would be a simple, victorious walk into the next chapter. Wrong again. First problem, it's flood season. The river isn't gently flowing. It's swollen, angry, and loud, rushing like it knows you're coming and isn't happy about it. You stare at it and feel the first flicker of doubt. Why now? Why not wait for safer conditions? But then Joshua announces confidently, "The priests will go first." The what now? You look at the priests, barefoot, robed, holding the Ark of the Covenant, and think, they're not exactly Olympic swimmers, but they step in anyway. No hesitation, feet into the river, and nothing happens. Not immediately. The current still roars, your stomach clenches, and then, somewhere far upstream, the water stops. It doesn't drain. It doesn't part dramatically like with Moses. It just halts, like God put his hand down and said, "Not today." And as the riverbed dries in front of you, stone by stone, the path appears. But here's the twist. The river doesn't stop for you. It stops for them, the priests standing still, holding the ark, unmoving as the people cross past them by the thousands. They don't walk, they don't rest, they just hold the presence and wait. You realize then, this moment is sacred, but also exhausting. Not every breakthrough is effortless. Some require standing in wet, unstable ground while others move forward. And you? You walk, eyes wide, feet hesitant, not because the path is unclear, but because you know what it cost to make it appear. Each step feels heavier than expected, not because the mud pulls at you, but because you're carrying more than your body. You're carrying the weight of memory. You cross, not just from one side to the other, but from wilderness to responsibility, from wandering to inheriting. By the time you reach the far bank, your heart is pounding, not from fear, but from reverence. You look back. The priests are still there, holding, waiting, until the last person is across. Only then do they move. Only then does the river return to its course. And it hits you. Crossing wasn't the miracle. Trusting was. You thought the fighting would feel like triumph, like fireworks and war cries and adrenaline pumping in your chest as you finally claimed the land that had been promised to your ancestors. You pictured bold marches, divine victories, and enemies fleeing before your sandals even touched the soil. Instead, it feels like paperwork and dirt and endless repetition. The first few days in the land were thrilling. The crossing of the Jordan, the stones of remembrance, the moment you finally stood on promised ground after generations of waiting. You looked around and thought, we made it, this is it. But no one mentioned that entering the promise wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of the battle. Jericho was your first test, and it was nothing like you expected. Not a fight, a parade. God told you to march, in silence, for 6 days. Just walk around the walls, once per day, while the people inside stared down at you with confusion, suspicion, and probably amusement. You did it anyway, because Joshua said to, because the ark was out front, because after all this time, maybe walking in circles was just what obedience looked like. And then, on the 7th day, you marched again, 7 times, blew the trumpets, shouted, and the walls came down like cardboard. Just like that. That felt good. You thought, maybe this is how it's going to be. Faith, not fists. God fights for us. We just show up. But then came Ai, a small city, a routine battle. You didn't even send the whole army, and they routed you, sent your soldiers running, killed 36 men in a single day. You stood in the aftermath, stunned, mouth dry, as fear spread like wildfire. That's when the layers started peeling back. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about the heart. Someone had disobeyed, taken what was forbidden, hidden what was meant to be surrendered. And suddenly, you realized this conquest wasn't going to be clean. It was going to be holy, and holiness is always more expensive than you planned for. From there, the victories and losses piled up like chapters in a book you weren't sure you wanted to keep reading. Cities burned, kings captured, territories mapped and distributed. But with every fight, there was always more land, more resistance, more instructions. It turns out inheriting a promise still requires you to show up every day. You thought maybe God would just hand it to you, sweep the enemies away with angelic armies, and let you enjoy the fruit trees without bruises or blood. But no, he gives you the land little by little, not all at once, so you don't forget how to rely, so you don't become soft, so you remember whose promise you're living in. And now, you're tired. Not the we walked too long kind of tired. The how long does this go on kind of tired. The kind of tired that sinks into your bones and whispers questions at night like, was this really worth it? Or, will I ever feel settled? You've seen miracles. You've seen justice. You've seen God take down empires. And yet, the enemies keep coming. The ground doesn't give itself up. The victories still require sacrifice. You notice it in the way people speak now. Less shouting, more sighing, less celebration, more calculation. Even the warriors walk with limps. And still, you press forward. Because giving up isn't an option. You didn't come this far to circle back. You didn't bury elders in the desert to let fear resurrect them in your spirit. You didn't march around walls and cross rivers and stare down armies to sleep on the edge of your inheritance. This is the cost. This is what faith actually looks like when the songs stop and the sandals wear thin. Not mountaintops and choirs, but calluses and courage, dirt in your teeth, bruises on your knees, and the quiet, fierce belief that this fight, however exhausting, is still holy. Some days you miss the manna, the predictability, the pillar of fire, the cloud, the clear leadership, the voice that thundered from Sinai. Now, things are more subtle, more spread out. You have to listen harder, move slower, choose trust without lightning bolts to light the way. And maybe that's the point. Maybe this is what maturity in the promise feels like. Not being fed, but learning to plant. Not being protected from battle, but being equipped for it. Not waiting for God to carry you, but walking in what he's already given, even when your muscles scream for rest. So yes, you're tired, but you're also stronger than you were in Egypt. You're wiser than you were in the wilderness. You're no longer asking God to prove himself. You're asking how to carry what he's placed in your hands. You finally got to fight for something, and yes, you're already tired. But now you understand. The promise was never about comfort. It was always about becoming the kind of person who can hold it without letting it slip through your fingers. It was supposed to be a break. After all the battles, all the marching, all the blood and dust and shouted commands, you finally had a moment to breathe. The land had quieted. The enemies had been driven back, for now. And so you exhaled. Let your armor rest. Let your guard drop. Just for a little while. And that's when it happened. It wasn't a golden calf this time. You'd learned your lesson there. At least, you thought you had. No one melted down earrings. No one shouted, "Behold your gods." It was quieter than that. Slower. More subtle. It started with a hilltop, a scenic view. Someone said, "Shouldn't we mark this place? It's significant. This is where the Lord delivered us." So they built a stone. Just a stone. For remembrance. No harm in that, right? Then someone suggested a feast. A little wine, a little dancing, nothing wild. Just a way to honor the victory, to celebrate what God had done. Then someone else brought out a carved figure, not to worship, just as a symbol, a representation, a visual reminder of the invisible. "It helps me focus when I pray," they said. And you nodded, because that made sense. You were tired of straining your heart to feel something intangible, something mysterious and demanding, and sometimes painfully silent. Maybe a physical object, a symbol, would help bridge the gap. You didn't call it an idol. You called it inspiration, devotion, culture. But before long, it grew. The songs started changing. The language around God became looser, more poetic, less precise. The laws got quoted less and paraphrased more. The figure on the altar changed shape, got polished, adorned, and when someone finally suggested offering a sacrifice, just a small one, you hesitated for only a moment, because deep down, you were lonely. The God who brought you out of Egypt had always been holy, powerful, vast, but he had also been terrifying, sometimes distant, hard to understand. He didn't always explain himself, he didn't always respond the way you hoped, and this idol, this little piece of stone or wood, it didn't argue, didn't test you, didn't demand obedience or bring down fire from heaven. It was controllable, tangible, soothing even, and maybe in a moment of fatigue that felt like enough. But the thing about idolatry is that it never announces itself. It doesn't burst into your tent in gold and thunder. It sneaks in through convenience, through comfort, through the quiet moments when your hunger for the divine gets lazy and you reach for something easy instead of something real. And then one morning, someone stands up and asks, "Why aren't we winning anymore?" The crops are failing. The enemies are creeping back. The peace you thought you had starts to unravel. And suddenly, everyone's looking at everyone else, confused, suspicious, afraid. You know the answer, you just don't want to say it. You've seen this before, generations ago in the wilderness, when your ancestors grew impatient, when Moses disappeared up a mountain and didn't come down for weeks, when the people panicked and decided to make something they could touch, worship on their own terms, in their own timing, and here you are again. You thought idolatry was about golden animals and wild parties, but now you see it's really about control, about refusing to wait, about shaping God in your image instead of letting him shape you. The real tragedy? It didn't feel like rebellion, it felt like relief. That's the danger. And now comes the hard part, tearing it all down, again. You gather your neighbours, you admit what happened, you confess that somewhere between victory and rest, you forgot how to hunger for holiness. You traded awe for comfort, mystery for something manageable, and the worst part, you were so deep in it you didn't even realise. You start breaking the altars, smashing the figures, burning the groves, and it hurts. Not because you loved the idols, but because you had built a version of your life around them, a rhythm, a language, a way of being that didn't demand so much of your soul. But you do it anyway, because now you remember what it felt like to be led by fire, to tremble at the mountain, to receive mercy after failure, not because you earned it, but because he chose you anyway. And you want that again. You don't want a God you can carry. You want a God who carries you, even if he's harder to understand, even if he doesn't always speak when you want, even if he keeps asking for your whole heart instead of your best performance. You learn, all over again, that rest without reverence always becomes rot. That idolatry doesn't need a temple, it just needs your inattention, and that spiritual laziness always leads to spiritual slavery. So you rebuild the altar, not to the image you made, but to the God who made you. You light the fire again, you open the scroll, you kneel, not because it's easy, but because it's right. You took a break from war and you slipped, but grace is still here, calling you back. This time, you meant it. You stood there with your hand over your heart, eyes lifted to the sky, and said all the right words. We will obey the Lord. We will serve him only. The crowd echoed it, boldly, loudly, almost like the volume of your voices could drown out the failures still clinging to the edge of your memory. You weren't faking. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You really meant it. After everything, the 40 years of wandering, the cracked stones of Jericho, the idol burning in the valley, you finally grasped what obedience costs. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't theoretical. It was sacrifice. And for the first time, saying yes to God didn't feel like performance. It felt like surrender. Joshua stood before you, solid and still, a weathered man with desert in his eyes and war in his bones. His voice didn't shake. You are witnesses against yourselves, he said, not as a threat, but as a reminder. You've chosen to serve the Lord. And you nodded, firmly, confidently, like it was final, like nothing could move you now. For a few days, it actually worked. You went back to your homes and cleaned up your lives, removed the last of the trinkets, the household gods you swore had no power. You unearthed the amulets you had buried just in case, and cast them out. You lit the lamp in the tent again. You sang the old songs, the ones your parents used to hum in the dark, and for a moment you felt anchored, holy even. Like maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But obedience is strange like that. It's easy when the sun is out and no one's asking anything hard of you, when you're not grieving, when no one's betraying you, when your needs are being met. Obedience under ideal conditions feels manageable, righteous even, almost energizing. But then came the slow tests. A neighbor crossed the boundary line. Your barley harvest came up thin. Someone made an offensive joke at the market and you smiled, then laughed. Not because it was funny, but because calling it out felt exhausting. You started skipping evening prayers, not because you rejected God, but because you were tired. And slowly the resolve began to unravel, not all at once, not with fire or rebellion or some dramatic betrayal, just one decision at a time. One, it's fine. One, God knows my heart. One, this isn't really a big deal. You weren't negotiating with God, you were negotiating with yourself, making small allowances, quiet exceptions, reframing obedience as suggestion instead of command. You still believed, still cared, still loved him, but your faith, once loud and burning, grew quiet. Dimensois like coals cooling beneath ash. Not dead, just unattended. And when things started falling apart, relationships fraying, bitterness creeping in, that old apathy curling up around your spirit, you were surprised, shocked even, shocked that the fire didn't stay lit just because you'd lit it once, shocked that your heart didn't keep itself aligned out of sincerity alone, shocked that a vow made in full sincerity could still fracture in silence when no one was watching. But Joshua wasn't shocked. He knew. That's why he made you place the stone. Not a metaphor, not a proverb, a literal rock, tall and jagged, standing in the open as a witness, not to your perfection, but to your intention, to the moment you meant it, to the promise you made when your hands were still clean and your heart was still soft. And now, every time you walk by it, it says nothing. And everything, it doesn't shame you. It reminds you that you did mean it, that you were sincere, that you knew what mattered once. It reminds you that failure doesn't erase that moment. It just calls you back to it. Because obedience isn't a one-time event. It's not sealed in a single speech or preserved in a ceremonial gathering. It's a practice, a rhythm, a recalibration that happens 100 times a week, sometimes 100 times a day. And maybe, just maybe, you still can return. Not because you've earned another chance, but because he never withdrew the invitation. It was quiet when he died. No fire, no earthquake, no farewell speech drawn from the heavens. Just age, a body worn thin by battle and leadership. A man who had carried you from conquest to covenant now lay still beneath a tree's shadow, and no one knew what to say. You buried him in the hill country, the land he helped you take, the land you wouldn't even be standing on if not for his courage. And as the last stones were placed over his grave, something shifted. Not just in the ground, but in you. Joshua was more than a leader. He was the bridge, the one who remembered Egypt but lived to taste Canaan. He knew the ache of slavery and the thrill of fulfillment. He didn't just believe the promise, he fought for it. Every inch of land you now call home bears the weight of his footsteps. And now, with his absence, the ground beneath your inheritance suddenly feels shaky. Because who leads now? He wasn't Moses. He didn't part seas or speak with thunder, but he was steady, brave, unshakably loyal to the God of Abraham. When everyone else wanted to run back to Egypt, Joshua stood firm. When others hesitated, he walked forward. And when your generation took their first trembling steps into the promise, it was Joshua who said, "Be strong and courageous." Now, no one's saying it. The elders gather, but their voices waver. Decisions take longer. Confidence is quieter. The people begin to drift, not in open rebellion, but in slow forgetfulness. Fields need tending. Families need homes. Peace is harder to maintain than war ever was. And without a clear voice, the center doesn't hold as tightly. You try to remember his lessons, his commands. Choose this day whom you will serve. It echoes in your head, strong and clear. But the echo fades, and life gets louder. You don't mean to forget. But there's something about abundance that makes memory fragile. When manna no longer falls from the sky, and you're harvesting from vines you didn't plant, it's easier to believe the struggle is over, that the story has reached its final page, that faithfulness is no longer urgent. And then come the murmurs, small suggestions, little shifts, marriages with people from nearby tribes, trade agreements with neighboring gods. It's subtle. No one's building golden calves. They're just relaxing, blurring lines, letting go of the urgency that once defined you, because Joshua is gone. And without him, the standard wavers. You feel it most when you pass his grave, a mound of stone in the hillside. No monument, no shrine, just memory, a sacred silence that seems to ask you what kind of person you will be when the leader is no longer watching. And maybe that's the point. Joshua didn't lead to make a name for himself. He didn't build statues or commission songs. He led so you would remember God, so you would carry the fire without needing someone else to hold the torch. So the covenant wouldn't rest on one man's voice, but on the people's willingness to listen. But you're not sure you're ready. His absence has revealed just how much you depended on his presence, on his clarity, on his strength. And now that he's gone, you're left with a haunting question. Was your obedience rooted in conviction or just proximity to someone else's faith? Without him, everything feels fragile again. And maybe now is when the real test begins. Not the test of conquest, but of continuation. Not the battle for land, but the battle for loyalty. Not the fight to enter the promise, but to remain in it. And this fight will not be won with swords, but with memory. You really thought they would. After all, how could they forget? You told them the stories. Around fires. At festivals. During long walks through the vineyards you didn't plant and the homes you didn't build. You pointed at the stones by the Jordan and said, "That's where the river stopped." You told them about Manna, about Moses, about Jericho, about snakes and fire and mercy. You assumed it would be enough, but somewhere along the line, it wasn't. The next generation didn't remember the hunger, or the waiting, or the fear. They never knew what it was like to rely on God for daily bread, or to sleep in tents beneath stars you thought might fall on you. They were born into comfort, into land, into peace, into all the answered prayers you barely believed would come true. And slowly, subtly, their questions started sounding different. Why can't we trade with them? Why do we still follow those old commands? What's wrong with the gods they serve? You tried to answer gently, patiently, but every reply felt like it fell a little shorter than the one before. The awe in their eyes wasn't there. They didn't shiver when the law was read. They didn't feel the weight of the covenant like you did, and soon the shrines went up. Not in rebellion, in curiosity, in convenience. The people they married had their own customs, their own festivals, their own gods. It's just culture, your children said, just tradition. But you knew. You remembered what happened the last time someone said those exact words. You saw it coming, but couldn't stop it. Not with lectures, not with stories, not even with consequences. Because the problem wasn't what they were doing. It was what they had forgotten. They forgot God, not because you didn't tell them, but because somewhere between comfort and conquest, the urgency was lost. The fire that once burned so hot in your bones had cooled into ritual. Your obedience became routine, and they inherited the habit without the hunger. Now you see it happening again, patterns repeating. Slavery not by chains, but by choice. And you feel the ache, not just of disappointment, but of fear. Because this time, you're not sure there's a Joshua to bring them back. So you whisper prayers over them at night. Quiet, desperate ones. Not to impress, but to plead. Because while you can't make them remember, you can beg God not to forget them. For years, you blamed the wilderness. You blamed the sand, the heat, the endless walking, the way your skin cracked and your feet ached, the way your stomach turned at the same food every day, the way nothing ever felt stable or safe. You told yourself that if only the conditions were better, if you had enough water, better leadership, fewer enemies, you would have been more faithful, more grateful, more obedient. You thought the problem was the environment, but now, standing in the promised land, with everything you once begged for finally in your hands, shelter, fields, stability, you feel it again. That pull, that restlessness, that temptation to drift, to complain, to forget, and it hits you. The wilderness was never the enemy. It just exposed what was already inside you. When you didn't have enough, you grumbled. Now that you have more than enough, you hoard. When life was hard, you doubted God's presence. Now that it's easy, you ignore him. The location changed. The heart didn't. You thought the trials were shaping you. That pain was your biggest teacher. But comfort, it turns out, is far more dangerous. It numbs. It distracts. It gently pulls your focus until one day you wake up and realize you haven't prayed in weeks. And not because you were angry or hurting, but because everything felt fine. You start to understand why God let the wilderness stretch as long as it did. Not to punish you, to prepare you, to strip away the illusions that you were strong on your own. To teach you that dependence isn't weakness. It's the only way you survive. To make sure the faith that led you into the land was strong enough to keep you rooted once you got there. But somewhere between the desert and the harvest, you forgot, and now the cycle is repeating. It's not as dramatic. No pillars of fire or seas splitting, just slow compromise, a drift of affection, a quiet choosing of other loves, the kind of betrayal that wears a smile and says it's just being open-minded. You used to beg God for breakthrough. Now you forget to even ask. You used to cling to every word of the law like it was life. Now it feels optional, cumbersome, like maybe it belongs to another generation. And still, you wonder why the fire is gone, why the miracles have faded, why the power feels distant. But maybe the question isn't where God went. Maybe the question is what you let in to take his place. Because the wilderness revealed your need, and the land revealed your pride, and both were mercy. You think of all the ways you tried to fix external problems when the internal ones remained untouched. You blamed Pharaoh, then Moses, then the golden calf, then your enemies. But at every turn, the problem was the same. You wanted God's blessings more than you wanted God. And now, for the first time in years, you say it aloud, not to impress, not to earn anything back, just to be honest. It was never the wilderness. It was me. The words sting. But they also set you free. Because if the real problem was always your own heart, then the real hope was always God's mercy. And that hasn't changed. You tried. For years, you tried. Tried to be worthy, tried to be good enough, tried to obey perfectly, to pray correctly, to worship with just the right amount of trembling and joy, as if that were the secret formula to keeping the blessing intact. You held your breath every time something went wrong, wondering what rule you had broken, what vow you had failed, what offering you had forgotten. Because somewhere along the line, you started believing the promise was conditional. Sure, God said it was yours. He said he'd give you the land, make you prosper, protect your enemies from overtaking you. But deep down, you believed there had to be a catch, a clause in fine print, a test hidden in plain sight. So you lived like a tenant, not an heir, always waiting for the eviction notice. You thought obedience was payment. You thought worship was performance. You thought your faith had to be impressive enough to justify God's favor. And for a while, that kept you going. You were disciplined, reverent, careful. Every decision calculated, every word measured, every emotion scrutinized for hints of doubt. You wore faith like armor, hoping it would hide how insecure you still felt inside. But the cracks started showing, because when you live like the promise depends on you, then every failure becomes a threat. Every bad day becomes a divine warning. Every unanswered prayer feels like punishment. You started fearing God, not with awe, but with anxiety. And the peace that was supposed to come with the promise, it never arrived. Until one day, you stopped. You were tired, not from sin, from effort, from carrying a weight your soul was never built to hold. You sat in the shade of a tree in the land you once cried out for, and finally asked the question that had been gnawing at you for years. What if I can't keep this up? And then came the answer, not in thunder, not in fire, but in quiet memory. The voice of God echoing through the years. I didn't choose you because you were strong. I chose you because I love you. You remembered. You remembered the night in Egypt when the blood on the doorpost saved your life. Not because you deserved it, but because he covered you. You remembered the wilderness, where manna fell each morning whether you were grateful or not. You remembered the battles you didn't win, but somehow survived. You remembered the sins that should have disqualified you, but didn't, and it hit you like the first breeze after years of drought. The promise was never a transaction. It was always a gift. All your striving had been trying to earn what was freely given. All your discipline had become a disguise for fear. All your guilt was just misplaced reverence. God didn't ask you to impress him. He asked you to walk with him. And that changed everything. You started reading the commandments again, not as a checklist, but as an invitation. A glimpse into God's heart. A way to stay close, not stay qualified. You stopped measuring your prayers. You just started talking, rambling, raw, honest. And for the first time in years, you felt like he was listening. You gave up trying to be the perfect example for the next generation and just started being present, laughing, confessing, telling the truth. Your kids didn't need a spiritual role model. They needed someone real enough to admit when they didn't know what they were doing, and humble enough to keep turning back anyway. And the land? It didn't disappear. The harvest didn't dry up. The walls didn't crumble. In fact, everything started to bloom. Because grace doesn't grow in perfection, it grows in surrender. You looked around and saw it all clearly. Not as something you'd earned, but something you'd received. Not because you were faithful, but because he is. That didn't make you lazy. It made you grateful. You started obeying, not to prove something, but to stay close to the one who never left. You started praying, not to impress, but to connect. You started worshipping, not to earn favor, but because you already had it. And finally you knew peace, not because your enemies disappeared, not because every prayer was answered, not because you finally felt holy, but because the pressure was gone. You were home. And it was never about the land anyway. It was about the presence that brought you there. If you made it this far, thank you. This story was a journey, through wandering, grumbling, grace, and growth. If it made you laugh, reflect, or even feel a little called out, you're not alone. If you enjoyed this series, you know what to do. Tap that subscribe button, drop a comment about your favourite chapter, and share it with someone else wandering through their own desert. I'll be back with more soon. Until then, rest in the promise. even if you're still learning to believe it. Ghost saved your life. Not because you deserved it, but because he covered you. You remembered the wilderness, where manna fell each morning whether you were grateful or not. You remembered the battles you didn't win, but somehow survived. You remembered the sins that should have disqualified you, but didn't, and it hit you like the first breeze after years of drought. The promise was never a transaction. It was always a gift. All your striving had been trying to earn what was freely given. All your discipline had become a disguise for fear. All your guilt was just misplaced reverence. God didn't ask you to impress him. He asked you to walk with him. And that changed everything. You started reading the commandments again, not as a checklist, but as an invitation, a glimpse into God's heart, a way to stay close, not stay qualified. You stopped measuring your prayers. You just started talking, rambling, raw, honest. And for the first time in years, you felt like he was listening. You gave up trying to be the perfect example for the next generation and just started being present, laughing, confessing, telling the truth. Your kids didn't need a spiritual role model. They needed someone real enough to admit when they didn't know what they were doing, and humble enough to keep turning back anyway. And the land? It didn't disappear. The harvest didn't dry up. The walls didn't crumble. In fact, everything started to bloom. Because grace doesn't grow in perfection, it grows in surrender. You looked around and saw it all clearly. Not as something you'd earned, but something you'd received. Not because you were faithful, but because he is. That didn't make you lazy. It made you grateful. You started obeying, not to prove something, but to stay close to the one who never left. You started praying, not to impress, but to connect. You started worshipping, not to earn favor, but because you already had it. And finally you knew peace, not because your enemies disappeared, not because every prayer was answered, not because you finally felt holy, but because the pressure was gone. You were home. And it was never about the land anyway. It was about the presence that brought you there. If you made it this far, thank you. This story was a journey, through wandering, grumbling, grace, and growth. If it made you laugh, reflect, or even feel a little called out, you're not alone. If you enjoyed this series, you know what to do. Tap that subscribe button, drop a comment about your favourite chapter, and share it with someone else wandering through their own desert. I'll be back with more soon. Until then, rest in the promise. Even if you're still learning to believe it.